I won't call it a conspiracy, but when it's measured, it happens to be cons and piracy mixed together. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to Part 5 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of select material from Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, in which the president of that organization will allege that a cabal of fake autistic people has seized control of an advisory committee within a U.S. federal executive body for the purpose of canceling and marginalizing real autistic people. Is this the so-called neuromob that Jill Escher alluded to back in part 1 of this series?
Okay, are you hearing me? Right? Sia has so completely capitulated to the neuromob.
Somehow I doubt it.
It boggles my mind, and it shouldn't be that way. It's completely irrational.
For the next clip from the NCSA podcast episode, I will be temporarily bleeping out parts of what Jill's going to say. This is not me canceling her, as I will be playing and responding to the unedited footage momentarily. It's not censorship. It's an act of benevolence. I'm removing Jill's foot from her own mouth for her, because I'm so desperate for things to agree with her on that I'm going to alter what Jill's about to say into something at least arguably worth engaging with just by deleting a few words from this next clip of hers.
Kind of like pre-cutting a meal for a small child.
Exactly, Greg from Pop Arena. It's like pre-cutting a meal for a small child, because someone's got to be the adult in the room, even if that adult turns out to be a cartoon dog alien on the internet.
I want to emphasize one thing that Dr. Lopez mentioned regarding cancellation. I think that unfortunately, what we've seen amongst individuals who would be more on the end of the high-functioning autism, who don't have language impairment or intellectual disability, is a sad, almost immediate knee-jerk reaction to cancel those on the more severe end of the autism spectrum. And you do not see the reverse. You typically don't see, caregivers of those with severe or profound autism who are not capable of engaging these types of discussions, wishing to cancel those on the higher functioning end of the spectrum. But that's made for a really challenging landscape in terms of moving forward and meeting the needs of a wide range of individuals with autism.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high functioning autism or attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Ridding the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but ridding the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are severely disabled. So you see a kind of real life, almost explicit kind of erasure, right, of the terms that would characterize the realities faced by those who are more severely impacted.
I would agree. Discourse over the details of disability language can be like steaming the boiler of a machine. A certain amount of it under control can be useful. An excess amount of it without control just becomes senseless, undirected energy that gets no work done and can harm innocent people. The ongoing history of negativity and disrespect regarding disability has led some to overcorrect, in my opinion, and try to secure respect for the disabled by discouraging the use of any language or phrasing with any remote implication of negativity, even when dealing with impairments characterized by difficulty, peril, pain, and suffering. As a hypothetical example, if the parents of a disabled child post a message online asking for help on how to better understand their kid or help them fulfill their potential, whatever that may be, they don't need to get flooded with angry responses from keyboard warriors reacting to something such as that parent using out-of-date clinical language, not knowing that that's no longer being used. That's not the equivalent of them defaming their child. That's why situations like these should not be handled by online keyboard warriors, but instead by seasoned keyboard shamans, like me. I literally carry a keyboard everywhere I go. Anyway, these are the sort of extremes online disability discourse can sometimes get into, and while some may argue whether or not it's widespread, it happens enough that some parents of high support needs autistic kids feel as though the online autistic self-advocates are an inherently antagonistic element in their lives. It might even be seen as the opposing parallel to when parents of high support needs autistic children go online or even in the real world and say that the ability for someone to speak, read, write, use the internet in ways their own kids can't is proof that someone can't possibly be legitimately disabled or autistic or have support needs. Maybe it's a cycle of self-sustaining negative behavior that needs to stop. You know, there was one autistic friend I had in college. I actually received disability services alongside them. I often sat at a booth at Applebee's with them amongst other friends I went to college with. And sometimes that autistic friend of mine would repeat some wacky contradictory nonsense about disability rights they picked up on an autism blog or whatever. And I would sometimes, if I even felt like it on that particular night, I'd attempt to explain in a diplomatic manner that even if the person who wrote that sincerely feels that way, perhaps that doesn't necessarily hold up under closer examination. Perhaps it might even risk undoing progress the disability rights movement has fought for. Only for my other autistic friend with way less nuance than me to just blurt in and be like, nah man, that sounds like some dumb shit you heard on Tumblr, what's wrong with you? Now, all that is to say, I agree with Jill to the extent that I feel like things like micromanaging and geostigmatizing clinical terminology with any sense of negativity is generally going to be a setback. It runs the risk of discouraging people from accurately describing the struggles of themselves or of loved ones for fear of facing disapproval. Now, I did the National Council on Severe Autism, which I don't even like, the favor of responding in agreement with its president, even if that agreement was to a version of that statement that I edited and altered into something I felt worth responding to. Now, let's listen to the dumb shit that Jill actually spoke into the microphone the day she recorded that podcast.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Ridding the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but ridding the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled. So you see a kind of real life, like almost explicit kind of erasure, right, of the terms that would characterize the realities faced by those who are more severely impacted. And
what the fuck was that, Jill? I'm not letting that slip by me.
yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic.
To make myself clear for the purpose of this video series of mine, I will endorse no position in favor of or against the concept of self-diagnosis of autism, though I will say the NCSA would probably ultimately disagree with my personal opinion on that subject, and that a lot of online neurodiversity warriors might be offended by my opinion too. But my opinion on that subject doesn't matter here. In my opinion of self-diagnosis doesn't matter even outside of this present setting, for reasons I might discuss later.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic.
I would say, for those who consider professional evaluation by a trained and licensed practitioner to be important as a factor in validating someone's disability status, and for those who consider self-diagnosis of autism to be inherently illegitimate or even dangerous, the fact that the National Council on Severe Autism's president, Jill Escher, and several of her friends and allies consistently speak of the clinical diagnosis of what they call non-severe autism and the amateur self-diagnosis of autism, as though those two things are, or even might be fungible with one another, is something that should seriously concern you. Would you support a group that advocates the importance of professional diagnosis of autism when they have published a podcast episode, in this case, whose primary purpose is to not only hold a public indignation meeting against specifically named people for receiving clinical autism diagnoses. But later on in this podcast, they'll discuss methods by which they, as NCSA allies, who are also members of the American Psychiatric Association that writes the DSM, could push for neurodevelopmental disability profiles the NCSA doesn't personally favor to be delisted from future diagnostic manuals. And NCSA members and allies in this podcast already consider high-functioning autistic people to be out of line for speaking of the challenges that they face. They also accuse them of wrongfully accessing disability services and special education that they have been systematically entitled to for over 30 years.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
All on the basis that their alleged personality quirks don't constitute disabilities. A lie that professional-grade diagnostic literature going back at least 30 years. I personally feel, for this reason, as though the NCSA under Jill Escher's leadership has made it a key objective of theirs to turn public and professional opinion against ASD Level 1 patients, and also to evict them from semantic spaces of disability that they were placed in by their own clinicians. Also, Jill can make the word autism into a private domain of her and her friends' autistic family members.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic.
And if you align with the NCSA's evident distrust of high-functioning autism because you trust this podcast's implication that non-severe autism is a recent invention of the DSM-5 in 2013, and that historical constructions of the autism concept from the 70s and 80s would have never validated such a farce, we have documented proof to the contrary, as discussed in this clip from a different podcast, which I'll provide in altered form below.
I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I'd say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And unless they emphatically, that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that we're sort of saying, well, high functioning autism was missed. Like, oh no, not really. I'm not sure if we actually have proof of that, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just making a side observation. Now, how did you get involved in autism advocacy? Because here you were.
It's important to note that I did alter that clip for brevity and for my current topical focus, and I promise to discuss that other podcast clip in its original form later, because I really need to sit down and break down how Jill said things in this clip from this podcast that I'm currently analyzing that need a lot of details clarified.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Ridding the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but ridding the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
Say that again. What, Jill? Let's truncate that a bit for brevity.
You see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic ridding the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but ridding the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
Based on this wording, Jill seriously appears to believe that suffering is an experience exclusive to who she calls low-functioning autistic people, that does not pertain to autistic people she calls higher functioning. Perhaps Jill might want to rephrase that to reflect a more compassionate attitude towards disabled people other than those she's most concerned with, and I think she has the right to better explain that comment, should she someday choose to do so. But whether or not Jill would rephrase that in hindsight, she recorded herself saying that on that day, and approved of it being posted to YouTube after passing it off to an editor. So that's what I'm going to respond to now.
You see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic reading the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but reading the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low-functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
So these critics of high-functioning autism, they like to make it out as though high-functioning autism was a phrase invented in 2013 to contextualize the merger of Asperger's syndrome into today's autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5, even though the concept of high-functioning autism existed within professional and academic discussion of autism, even within the context of the old autistic disorder, and diagnostic manuals above and beyond 30 years old, as something separate, though adjacent to Asperger's syndrome. But today, even if I were to play the NCSA's game and accept that all high-functioning autistic people today were really people who should have Asperger's syndrome, if the DSM-5 kept things as they were back in the 90s, back when Asperger's and autism supposedly had absolutely no relation, in which Asperger's wasn't a disability, but simply a trivial social quirk, which, by the way, was literally never the case. But even if I were to assume that all high-functioning autistic people of today would have otherwise been Asperger's syndrome patients if the DSM-5 was never written, why the fuck does Jill think that that would mean that high-functioning people have no stake in suffering in the autism field? Look at the Asperger's definition as it existed in the DSM-4. Look at this language: severe and sustained impairment, restriction and repetition in behavior, disturbance causing qualitative clinically significant impairment in important areas of functioning. This is what the president of the NCSA and her friends and allies want to use to dismiss ASD1 patients as really having the trivial social quirks of non-disabled people.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
You do have some people who are very quirky socially and have some slight sensory and behavioral challenges, and they might be diagnosed with autism. The people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right? Number two, I think,
by the way, Jill, just to interject real quick, we do talk about a spectrum. We typically we recognize. I mean, certainly in my office, in my interaction with my colleagues, we do recognize that there is a vast spectrum of autism. Is that what you're talking about?
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
They try.
That's the problem with we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from, because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's. Like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability, that's fine, but they're just sort of speaking on behalf of everybody. They lean into dysfunction online is what I see, because they're in these online communities and they're observing other people, and other people will say like, well, you don't seem autistic, and so they just sort of like lean into whatever it is that they conceptualize autism to be, and they like become more dysfunctional and disabled because of it. That's
Well, those words didn't come out of Jill's mouth, but she certainly nodded in agreement to them. And I feel pretty confident that if I read the DSM-4 definition of Asperger's disorder to that last person that Jill nodded her head in agreement with, and told her that it was the definition for autistic disorder, that she would not only believe me without question, but accept that as proof that autism was the real disability and the real disorder, and that Asperger's was not. This is all literally pathological language. The description specifically contextualizes these characteristics as constituting suffering. This is the proof these motherfuckers want to use to claim that Asperger's syndrome wasn't a neurodevelopmental disability, and that the notion of it being related to autism was a renegade revision made out of nowhere in 2013 when the DSM-5 was enacted, and that people under this description, accessing special education and occupational therapy and other disability supports, was a radical insurgent reinvention of autism that insults the struggles of the so-called truly autistic, when that was already a reality for above and beyond 30 fucking years.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Reading the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but reading the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
I don't fucking trust Jill Escher or her National Council on Severe Autism. And it's not because I'm a radical neurodiversity partisan that wants to erase the struggles of autistic people like her children. I don't fucking trust Jill. Because if I assumed in that little rant of hers that she was targeting autistic people who might have been given an Asperger's diagnosis in the DSM-4 era, it means that she's taking people that the DSM-4 era language described as a starting point of having severe and sustained impairments with restricted and repetitive behaviors and a disturbance causing qualitative clinically significant impairment in important areas of functioning that can include pervasive hand and finger flapping and complex full body movements, and yet say that we not only aren't suffering, but are privileged.
The people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
Many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics, are claiming that all of their problems have been due by society instead of getting responsibility, their own responsibility for their problems. Some of them have really deep personality disorders. And
I mean, like, is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism? Some kind of personality disorder.
Personality disorders and
some kind of personality disorder.
Personality disorders and
some kind of personality disorder.
Fuck you!
Hey Jill, I know you like to justify your unhinged rancor toward autistic people like me by claiming that you're supposedly sticking up for the parents of real autistic kids. But I'll tell you what, if your non-doctor ass, who doesn't know me, went to the university I was sent to in 1994 while I was undergoing multiple day-long testing sessions to figure out why I paced in circles for hours, why shaking toy trains, why I could barely handwrite at all in spite of having a precociously advanced vocabulary, and why I was being bullied for facial tics, and you decided to tell my parents that not only was I not suffering, but not disabled. Well, the good news is the doctors could have done your stitches right there in the building. And if your non-doctor ass, who doesn't know me, happened to have told my parents that I was super privileged and hyper-functional, that I had a personality disorder, and that my clinically significant impairments were mere personality quirks that you were going to use a non-for-profit organization years later to campaign to the public to turn their opinion against people like me if we advocate for our interests as we grow older. Well, conveniently, the head injury ward would have been an elevator ride away. Of course, that's all hypothetical, and I don't think you had any stake in anything relating to autism over 30 years ago, even if I did, back when my main concerns were passing spelling tests and counting down the days till the new Thomas the Tank Engine tape came out. But what I do know is if there is one thing that you, Jill, should know about autism, it's that real autistic parents fight for their kids. Whether you, who is not a fucking doctor and never met the autistic people you are organizing against, personally consider them autistic or not.
That's the problem with we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from, because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's. Like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability, that's fine, but they're just sort of speaking on behalf of everybody.
We see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Reading the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but reading the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
I will never have the experience of being what Jill calls severely autistic, or having high support needs autism, or having low functioning autism, or whatever you want to phrase or style it as. I'll never pretend to know those struggles, and really the thought of appropriating those people's experiences for myself by attempting to speak on their behalf makes me feel physically ill in my stomach. But whether you want to call it Asperger's syndrome under DSM-4, or Autism Spectrum Disorder Level 1 under DSM-5, and whether or not you want to list out all the subspecifiers and comorbidities, I can speak about that experience. An experience that the DSM-4 described as a multitude of qualitative, sustained, and severe clinically significant impairments in important areas of my functioning, in spite of critics of high-functioning autism and ASD Level 1, spreading this myth that the now retired Asperger's syndrome diagnosis ASD-1 replaced was just trivial quirkiness and not a disability or an impairment at all, let alone a severe one. I know meltdowns from fireworks and overloads from getting haircuts. In fact, I haven't had a haircut since before I was diagnosed. I know being surrounded by my parents and a baffled team of doctors while I was having a prolonged sensory episode and couldn't speak. I know of evaluation for medications with as many drawbacks as benefits. I know of occupational therapy, motor skills therapy, social skills therapy, physical therapy, developmental skills training, workshops, peer interaction counseling. I know getting stared at for carrying a keyboard everywhere I go to function in a classroom and out in the real world. I know working with a therapist to minimize facial tics that interfered with my speech patterns. I know being threatened with physical punishment by my parents over those tics before I was diagnosed, back when they thought I was making rude faces at them to be disrespectful. I know having panic attacks over failing multiplication tests in 3rd grade while I was reading about logarithms and rhabdology at home for fun. I know being physically threatened in school by other students over echolalia and stimming, and for sensory equipment I wore at all times, and over word processors and other tools that I needed to function at my desk, and being challenged by authority figures over my right to even wear and carry those tools in the first place, especially when other kids tattled on me for having them to teachers and security they knew hadn't been specifically informed of my accommodations yet. I know all of that, and in spite of many other things I didn't even mention, they're all part of my experience. They all carry over into adulthood or in similar different forms. None of those are going to go away. And the list of difficulties I explain is only part of my personal, unique experience with what the DSM-5 calls Autism Spectrum Disorder Level 1, a level that these assholes insist is so trivialized that the thought of it as a legitimate disability of any description, let alone autism, is a violent insult to so-called true autistic children, in which people like me are falsely adopting autism as an identity option and blocking access to services and special education needed by real autistic people, even though people of the exact description they are holding to task have relied on these things for decades.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or leaving themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
The people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
They try.
And once again, my experience is just one incomplete example of what requiring minimal support as an ASD1 patient might look like. And I've lived a charmed life in which, thanks to early diagnosis leading to therapy and developmental support from an extremely early age that I received into adulthood, I attained a high level of self-reliance and independence, even if it still isn't normal and never will be. And even if some of that abnormality happens to consist of some of my strongest talents and greatest sources of joy in my life. I could do an entire multi-hour video series on my own experiences, but those experiences certainly do include suffering in the objective sense that it could be pathologically contextualized and attributed to clinically significant impairments in important areas of functioning, as the old DSM-4, which these people seem to like, would have put it. And that's just a small amount of what I stress is my personal experience of what I'm vividly aware is within the range of the least severely impacted of what may or may not be considered autism or Asperger's syndrome or whatever you want to call it. So Jill, even if it is actual hot bullshit that some people would fall within that relatively higher functioning range of autism and go to extremes and curse out some clueless but well-meaning parent of autistic child on social media for perhaps failing to use the most up-to-date community-preferred language, you still don't get to slip in some dismissive, trivializing slight in which you establish that suffering is something that only autistic people, specifically like your own children, have stake in, and that autistic people, like me, are somehow intruding upon that.
Yeah, I think these cancellation efforts are not subtle. I mean, you see right now people with high-functioning autism or who self-identify as autistic attempting to really control the language around autism, right? Reading the vocabulary, not of words that pertain to their autism, but reading the vocabulary that really pertains more to those who are low functioning and who are suffering and who are severely disabled.
Proceed, Madam President.
And then you see marginalization, for example, on the IAC, which is the Federal Advisory Committee on Autism. It's heavily stacked by people who, quote unquote, have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. Yeah. So, I mean, what you have in the end is this kind of exclusion and marginalization of, it's hard to say, it's about a third, at least, of the population that has more severe forms of autism. And then if you count the people who have borderline intellectual disability, who are clearly are in a segment that is struggling with autism, even though they may have language and, some cognitive capacity, above what the severe group has,
Whoa, what the fuck was that?
And then you see marginalization, for example, on the IAC, which is the Federal Advisory Committee on Autism. It's heavily stacked by people who quote unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who
But
are
they
very
don't.
high functioning. Yeah. So,
You know, I constantly challenged myself in preparing my criticism of this NCSA podcast as to whether or not I was interpreting certain things said by these people in an overly negative manner. I was trying to maybe grasp at straws to support my argument that this podcast was bullshit. I've listened to this entire podcast several hundred times, sometimes in slow motion. I have frequently replayed segments just a minute or two long on loop for hours at a time, just to analyze the intentions of word choices and ensure that I understood the people in this podcast with as few misconceptions as possible, even if I disagreed with their ideas. The whole reason I got involved in this mess is because I wanted to make a point that if you disagree with someone, it's important to represent your opponent's ideas honestly, even if you don't like them or what they're saying. That based on everything that they said in their podcast prior to that moment I just played, I feel like I could build the case against myself that I was interpreting Jill Escher and Dr. Wachtel in an overly negative manner to argue that the pair of them considered high-functioning autism a clinically false or illegitimate category of disability, when in fact they didn't feel that way at all, but were instead highlighting the more intense struggles and suffering of people who were profoundly impacted by this range of neurodevelopmental disability in ways that maybe don't apply to me. I built that case against myself to the point where I strongly considered whether or not I even wanted to do this video series. I observed the fact that there were people in the neurodiversity movement and within the autism self-advocacy scene who built their entire web presence around those associations. People who I consider far more activists in their positions, in their messages, than I am. People who I often don't even necessarily agree with. People that have mentioned or shown clips from this NCSA podcast on their platforms, but barely gave it half a typewritten page's worth of consideration. So if those arguably professional full-time neurodiversity or autism self-advocacy YouTubers don't think this is worth being angry over it in the way that I am, maybe I was barking up the wrong tree. Then they said this shit.
and then you see marginalization, for example, on the IAC, which is the Federal Advisory Committee on Autism. It's heavily stacked by people who quote unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are very high functioning. Yeah. So
according to Wikipedia, the IAC, or the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, is a federal U.S. advisory panel within the Department of Health and Human Services that coordinates HHS activities concerning autism spectrum disorder. Okay. Now, Jill is saying that marginalization against the severely autistic is damaging the effectiveness of this committee by way of people of a certain description she seems to disapprove of, in her words, stacking that board's membership demographics in ways we'll discuss in detail soon. Now, the word stack in the transitive verbal sense, as listed by Merriam-Webster, as in Form A, to secretly arrange for cheating, and in Form B, to arrange or fix so as to make a particular result likely. With that being established, who was it that Jill was saying stacked the membership slots in this government committee?
It's heavily stacked by people who quote unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are very high functioning. Yeah. So
we'll leave Dr. Wachtel's interrupting remark for later, but what Jill herself said was that the board was, in her exact words, stacked by people who quote-unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. There are several ways that this can be interpreted. Option 1 is Jill saying that this supposedly stacked committee is stacked by people falsely claiming to be autistic and disingenuously claiming to represent the well-being of all autistic people, but are instead exclusively concerned with the well-being only of high-functioning autistic people? Or is Jill saying that this committee is stacked with people that are claiming to be autistic, but really have high-functioning autism, and therefore aren't legitimately autistic at all? Either way, Jill seems to believe that someone being on a federal advisory committee on autism, while being a high-functioning autistic person, therefore constitutes an agenda to provide assistance only to high-functioning autistic people, which if true would fall into this repeated element where what the NCSA calls non-severe autism is treated like a bespoke club or political organization they're in opposition to, rather than a diagnostic range of neurodevelopmental disability, which is what it actually is. Honestly, there are at least two other reasonable constructions of what Jill's words in that passage could have meant. I really won't bother discussing those because Jill got interrupted by Dr. Wachtel mid-sentence, an interruption that Jill acknowledges and accepts, leaving us to trust that Dr. Wachtel's interruption coincides with what Jill wanted to express or what she believes.
It's heavily stacked by people who quote-unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. Yeah. So.
Oh, they don't. Well, that certainly removes a lot of the doubt I had and my concern for misinterpreting Jill's words to have the ugliest implication possible regarding her beliefs and messaging about high-functioning autistic people. I mean, we heard it ourselves. Jill mentioned, in her words, quote-unquote, have autism or represent autism, but really those, and she gets interrupted by Dr. Wachtel, as Dr. Wachtel says, but they don't, as Jill finishes her sentence about said people being high-functioning. Jill pauses to agree with Dr. Wachtel's interrupting remark. Now, Dr. Wachtel didn't get to hear Jill mention high-functioning autistic people as she spoke over her mid-sentence. So her, but they don't, was either A, in response to the idea that IAC members who said they had autism were really autistic, B, in response to the specific idea that those people represented autism, or C, in response to both of those ideas. Whether A, B, or C, Jill Escher agreed with Dr. Wachtel with no further qualifying statements, so I'll trust that Dr. Wachtel provided a more blunt and maybe more upfront framing of what Jill was trying to say in a more roundabout, perhaps diplomatic manner. So if Jill and Dr. Wachtel believe that IAC members reported as being autistic aren't actually autistic, I have several questions. Is this assertion based on the idea that these IAC members have high-functioning autism and therefore shouldn't be considered to have autism? Is this assertion based on an implication that these IAC members aren't professionally diagnosed and therefore shouldn't be trusted to accurately reflect the experiences or requirements of autistic people in general? Is this assertion based on an implication that these IAC members are parading dishonest clinical diagnoses secured for the purpose of wrongfully establishing credibility on autism issues, as the use of the word stack by Jill to describe arranged secret cheating might imply? Also, do Jill Escher and Dr. Wachtel believe that a person possessing a diagnosis reflecting what might be called high-functioning autism makes them inherently untrustworthy in regards to dealing with any concerns faced by what the NCSA calls severely or profoundly autistic people and their families and professional caretakers, against whom they would bear some kind of natural bias? Well, Jill and Dr. Wachtel are recordings, and they can't really speak to me. So how about I ask a question I could get an answer for myself, including federal members, public members, and alternate members. How many autistic people of any description were listed on the IAC website's biography page in spring 2023 when this NCSA podcast was most likely recorded? Well, using the Wayback Machine, we see where the official IAC website lists its current members, each with rather generous biographies and plenty of space for each member to list whatever credentials, experience, and associations they feel are relevant to their role as IAC members. Based on the most public-facing comprehensive descriptions and bios of their educational and professional backgrounds, and the lineup of members listed on the official IAC website at the time the NCSA recorded this podcast, the number of IAC members whose biographies and credentials either mentioned having an autism diagnosis, mentioned being autistic, or mentioned being involved in organized autism self-advocacy in the past or present was 8. 8 out of 64.
Holy shit!
That's 12.69%. Let's be nice to Jill and round that up to 13% for her. Now, for a membership roster that's supposed to be stacked with fake autistic conspirators, 13% somehow doesn't strike me as very impressive. Unless for some reason there happened to be some phenomenon in which a large number of IAC members didn't consider the fact of themselves being autistic to be something worth highlighting in regards to their involvement on the government-commissioned Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee of the United States, which would be very strange to me considering that not only are these profiles generously sized up to around half a typed page in length, they allow plenty of space for details, and they provide such a welcome environment for self-description that one of the PhD holders serving as an IAC member felt safe in describing themselves as, and I quote, an autistic, non-binary woman of color, and a multicultural, serodifferent, neurodiverse family, unquote. Well, I'm happy for them, whether I know what that means or not, though I do know that somehow I don't perceive this as an environment in which someone would feel the need to hide their autism diagnosis for fear of exclusion from the committee, which is as it should be. Now, what was it that Jill was saying about this disproportionate overrepresentation of IAC members describing themselves as autistic?
It's heavily stacked by people who quote unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. Yeah. So,
unless I'm misunderstanding Jill's meaning in ways she did absolutely nothing to help anyone learn about within her podcast, based on research I conducted on the IAC website, the comparison of its autistic to non-autistic membership makeup expressed visually looks like this. Oh my gosh, the autistic IAC members aren't dominating the council, they're being eaten alive! Someone help them! Even if Jill and Dr. Wachtel insist that these IAC members' claims of being autistic are in some way being made insincerely or inaccurately for the sake of those people furthering their agenda, it's quite a stretch of the imagination to perceive that 8 IAC members is an overrepresentation of anything, let alone Jill's implication of stacking, as in an organized scheme to covertly deceive by cheating in some insidious manner to the detriment of so-called real autistic people.
It's heavily stacked by people who quote unquote have autism or represent autism, but really just those who are high functioning. Yeah. So
marginalization of who? How's 13% of the IAC's membership being autistic going to marginalize or dominate anyone? If the president of the National Council on Severe Autism thinks 13% of the IAC's members being what she'd call high-functioning autistic people counts as a marginalization or a stacking against lower-functioning autistic people, when I would expect by that logic that 0% of the board's members are low-functioning autistic people, and that the representation of the other 87% of the board members appears to be non-autistic based on their official bios. How can I take any grievance the NCSA has on any issue seriously ever again? That's fucking scary. Because believe it or not, I think that some of the NCSA's concerns are serious and sorely undiscussed. But they're also spending time, energy, and charitably donated funds from the unsuspecting public on making up fake shit to be angry about for the purpose of holding disabled people to task for things that never actually happened. This is like someone buying a rubber dog turd from the back of a comic book, putting it in their own lawn, and complaining that their neighbor's dog shit on their lawn and ruined their grass, when none of their neighbors have dogs, and the fake shit isn't capable of actually damaging their lawn. Now, best case for the NCSA is that they failed to frame their complaints about the IAC in a way that makes sense, unless you have some prerequisite information they didn't mention in this podcast. the information that Jill and her doctor pals on the podcast with her as panelists would be privy to. I even checked their YouTube videos info box, hoping to find links, descriptions of anything so I could specifically respond to the issues they had, instead of taking time to read 63 different biographies of the members of a government committee I never heard of before and have no interest in defending, in the mere hope that I was collecting data that pertained to what the NCSA was talking about to begin with. Even the Wikipedia article on the IAC, which in all likelihood reflects a slow motion struggle between proponents and critics of that committee, lists certain criticisms of the IAC, but the NCSA doesn't even mention the complaints listed there in this podcast. Instead, they complain about an overabundance of high-functioning autistic people within the IAC's membership, stacking that organization's makeup against the interests of more severely disabled people by their description. When that population of disabled people on the IAC accounts for less than 13% of the membership at the time the NCSA recorded this shit, I really don't get it. Did they just think that no one would go and check this for themselves? Like, I'm suddenly reminded of episode 1 of my video series, where I mentioned how the NCSA, which I remind everyone is based in the United States, sounded the alarm over high-functioning autism patients dominating autism research and burying the struggles of the severely autistic. Their proof was by mentioning a UK study that said that only 6% of global autism research subjects possessed a learning disability, in a way that would reasonably be implied to a US audience that 94% of autism research patients had no disabilities that impeded their ability to function in a typical school setting. Meanwhile, the NCSA did nothing to explain where that study was written. The phrase learning disability specifically describes intellectual delay, an impairment in cognitive functionality, a definition that explicitly excludes most autistic people, including many autistic people with higher extent to their support needs. There was nothing in the NCSA's website feature explaining this, and whether there was an intentional effort to deceive or not. The writer not mentioning that is a serious lapse in communication with the public. I have a friend who writes professionally about autism and other disabilities. They are explicitly disallowed by their employers to use international statistics on disability, specifically to avoid misunderstandings like this. But this not-for-profit, calling itself a national council, can't bother to explain that on material posted on their own website? I don't think I'm nitpicking here, because details like that are critical to contextualizing their cause for concern, which could even be legitimate. The possibility that the writers of that feature, and everyone responsible for checking its clarity and accuracy, and the accuracy and clarity of other materials published to the NCSA's website, if none of them knew about this important detail that could fundamentally transform the meaning of the data being presented to support the writer's viewpoint, that just makes me concerned for the NCSA's ability to collect or present any outside statistics accurately or reliably, or even understand some of the phrases they're using and the context in which they use them. I mean, what if a lawmaker read this NCSA site feature and proposed legislation based on it, but had the totally incorrect idea of what that information even actually intended to communicate, whether on the NCSA's part or on behalf of the original study in the UK that collected that data? Now, if the writers of that article, and those responsible for its clarity and accuracy before putting it up on the website, did know about this key difference in UK versus US terminology, and still chose not to explain it, that makes me ask, how willing is the NCSA in allowing people to believe things about autism that they may know aren't necessarily true, if those misconceptions happen to paint a favorable image of the NCSA's positions and goals? Now, I admit, it's true that I have a personal bias against the National Council on Severe Autism, at least to the extent that I'm so deeply entrenched within my fetish-driven fantasy of being autistic that I personally, consistently impersonated a serialized list of neurodevelopmental abnormalities and eccentricities since I was an infant, many being lifelong, that I didn't know had clinical terminology or pathological descriptions attached to them until several decades after the fact, for the sole purpose of scoring appointments to be observed over the course of multiple day-long sessions at a university by a multidisciplinary team of medical and psychiatric professionals to receive an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis within the first months of that classification entering the DSM, freeing me up to bide my time through 19 years of occupational therapy, social skills therapy, meltdowns, shutdowns, panic attacks, not to mention ridicule and threats of violence from peers and mistrust from authority figures who routinely sent me to detention and threatened to confiscate my adaptive equipment, all while hedging my bets that a board of different doctors at the American Psychiatric Association, which I'd never heard of at the time, would rewrite the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which I also never heard of at the time, and redefine the Asperger's diagnosis I was given nearly 2 decades earlier, so that I could finally have the word autism in my diagnosis and fulfill my lifelong dream of parading the identity of autism around on the internet so anonymous assholes and irate Karens could call me a disability impersonator and make fun of my crappily drawn cartoon worms. But even having admitted that, I still don't think I'm extreme or weird for expecting a not-for-profit organization like the NCSA that wants to influence public policy regarding access to services and supports for autistic people to refrain from doing weird sneaky bullshit like saying that the U.S. Federal Advisory Committee for Autism has been caught in the ferocious conspiratorial grip of a cabal of ideologues who are falsely claiming to be autistic so that they could marginalize real autistic people. And especially not when that percentage of people, autistic people, on the advisory committee's website who describe themselves as autistic is less than 13%. So now, just to take a spot check on what the National Council on Severe Autism seems to think reasonable diversity of representation on the U.S. Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee would look like. The NCSA seems to think that high-functioning autistic people shouldn't be allowed to serve on the IAC, or at least thinks that too many of them are already serving on that council. And the NCSA also seems to think that low-functioning people obviously can't serve on the IAC, leaving the representation of actually autistic people on the IAC at 0? I mean, given that the NCSA seems to think that a mere 13% of IAC members even describing themselves as autistic as of spring 2023 somehow counts as autistic people, demographically dominating that committee's roster. A 0% autistic representation on the IAC sounds like something that the NCSA might find to be more fair and balanced. Fair and balanced in a specific, trademarked, and ironically slanted sense of the phrase. Now, my personal perceptions aside, honestly, the NCSA is breaking new ground by whistleblowing on this issue. If we let this trend of radical marginalization continue, by 2030, the blacks could seize total control over the Black Congressional Caucus, and the Women's Congressional Policy Institute will be run almost entirely by people that aren't even boys. And I don't even know what boys are. I mean, I thought I knew what boys were. I even thought I was one of them, until an AI spam bot tried to explain boys to me. Now I'm just confused and frightened, and whatever boys are, I want nothing to do with them.
Sina ike mute samani, sina ike sulitawa iyo, boys.
Boys, Anuseme.
Boys, sina kutepona, boys.
Well, that may have been confusing, but what's not confusing at all is Jill Escher's brave stance against autistic people who think they can get away with calling themselves autistic just because they were clinically diagnosed with autism. Someone needs to put privileged autism revisionist bastard butt-faced dum-dums like me in their place. And next time, I'll be covering a few key moments from a different episode of the NCSA podcast, where Jill brings on a guest panelist willing to stand by her side and tell those damn clinically diagnosed autistic people to stop pretending to be autistic, to stop writing poetry and stop doing art, stop serving on autism advisory boards, because those things are not for autistics.
Many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics, are claiming that all of their problems have been due by society instead of getting responsibility, their own responsibility for their problems. Some of them have really deep personality disorders.
Well, according to them, I'm not autistic, so I should be fine. I can't fucking wait, and I'm sure you can't either, so get your barf bags ready and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.
Exciting money-making game that will make you and your viewers rich big time.
This looks illegal in almost every country ever.
It may be illegal in a few countries, but countries are just stupid lines drawn on maps by stupid boys. I'm not one of those stupid boys. Not anymore. XLO laundering services. They are very useful if you want to use your XLO tokens, the inflation-free, non-legal tender digital currency of the future for laundering purposes.
Laundering purposes. Alright, this is too crazy not to check out. So, let's do it. I wasn't expecting that.
Yes, it's a laundromat. What did you think it was? Something bad?
Yeah.
Did you think I was providing services to misappropriate foreign currency?
Yeah.
Are you accusing me of being one of those boys?
Huh?
One of those stupid boys?
What?
A stupid boy, and that I made go away big time for sure. Just so you know, am not one of those boys.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about.
No.
I'm talking about boys.
Boys.
Boys!
Huh?
Listen, Super Train Station H, my Little Honey Bunches of Oats, part of a complete breakfast.
Black Cobra Military Services? Warlord Exterminations? What is this?
You're right. You don't want to click that link. Ignore that link. That link no longer works. It was a stupid business run by stupid boys. Stupid boys who did naughty things.
Naughty things like what?
It doesn't matter what they did. What matters is where they are. Those stupid boys are in Heckies. H-E double hockey sticks, the bad place. The shadow realm. And I say riddance, condemned to those stupid boys and those like them.
For once, I don't know what you're talking about, and I actually don't mind. Let's move on, please.